Hi everyone. So, over the last few lessons, then, we've been looking at the core principles and the core values of liberalism and what shaped that ideology. So, we saw that it was the antithesis to feudalism and it was about trying to create freedom and choice. Its sort of inception began in the Renaissance period, where you had the questionings of science and you had new developments in scientific thinking, um, especially when we're thinking about the Renaissance as this rebirth, going back to the classics and societies. And you had people like Rene Descartes, who said things like, I think, therefore I am. And a lot of the writing around this period between the Renaissance and really coming into fruition in the Enlightenment period was about this idea of human rationality, about the intelligence of human beings, and saying that they should have the ultimate decisions over their lives. And you can see this here. So this is a coffee house. This is a bit of a tenuous argument, but essentially, and I think this is something that's quite interesting to note, the birth of liberalism and the growth of liberalism really started to happen during the age of exploration. So, age of exploration obviously includes things like colonization, the murder of people of the countries in which they were colonized, and of obviously the transatlantic slave trade as well. So, this idea of liberalism and this idea of equality of man really did only refer to some people as well. But one of the things that kind of came out of this colonization and this exploration period was new things were brought to England. And one of the new things that were brought to England, obviously tobacco, which was, just to bear in mind, grown by initially indentured servants and then grown by West African slaves. But the other thing that also came in was coffee, and you had the growth of coffee houses in places like London. So whereas previously people went to the pub and they'd sit and have a discussion, but be drinking alongside that and getting drunk, and thus the conversation would become less of a high caliber. Then people started going to coffee houses instead, where they would read newspaper, discuss politics, discuss political thought and political thinking, whilst not getting drunk because they were drinking coffee instead. So it's a shift in culture in this idea, and it's in the developments of what's going on around the creation of the ideology. And then classical liberalism eventually ends in the 19th century and is replaced with a newer form of liberalism called modern liberalism, which we'll look at in subsequent lessons. So essentially, the core foundation of liberalism is this idea of natural rights. So Locke argued that this was life, liberty, and property. And then this was adopted in America when America had their revolution, and this was adapted a little bit by Thomas Jefferson. So very much inspired by Locke. I mean, you could even argue that he very much plagiarized Locke if you read some of the writings around the American Revolution. And he argues instead that the natural rights, so the God-given rights, and because they are God-given, they are inalienable, so you cannot question them, you can always recognize them. And these rights are life, liberty, and this is where the change happens, the pursuit of happiness. So the pursuit of happiness, it's not about property, because he was worried that people will feel that they had an entitlement to property, and instead he's just saying you have the right to pursue being happy as much as you like, although there's some limits to that, as I'm sure we will realise. So there is actually a counter to this then. So it's interesting because to liberals, natural rights are the foundation of the ideology, but then there are some deviations within liberalism, and one of those deviations is a theory called utilitarianism. And this is one of the founders of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham. So he's actually the founder of UCL as well, and this is his body, which you can go and see in UCL. So he actually donated his body to science because he felt that his body would be more useful with people doing experimentations for scientific discovery than it would be if he was just dead and decaying in the ground. So he said this, he said, natural rights are simple nonsense, natural and imprescriptible rights, rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. So he's arguing that they make no sense. So why is it? Why does he have such an uncomfortable view with natural rights? Why does he criticise them so vehemently as well? He also says, rights are the fruits of the law, and of the law alone. There are no rights without law, no rights contrary to the law, no rights anterior to the law as well. So what is it then that makes it so that, what's he advocating instead, sorry? So he's saying natural rights are not a suitable system in order to create order in a country. So what is he suggesting instead? And it comes to this idea about saying we shouldn't have governments deciding rights, because rights are saying what's right and what's wrong. So what we should be doing instead is, in order to measure what is right and what is wrong, we should have a simple measurement, and that is happiness is right and suffering is wrong. So essentially what he's arguing in his theory of utilitarianism is value or utility is anything which promotes happiness over suffering. And that's utility, something that promotes happiness over suffering. So utility is the desire for pleasure or happiness and the wish to avoid pain. So how do we measure this then? So if we're thinking about it, utilitarianism is saying, okay, so for a society then, so for something that individuals do, everything that we should do should be based on what causes more happiness and what causes less suffering. However, how does this work on a government level? So if we're going to do it on a government level, utilitarianism advocates that it's a moral philosophy which promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So it's actually about trying to make as many people as possible happy. So it's thinking in that sense about whenever you're making a decision, whenever a government is making a decision, the only thing that should be motivating them in that decision is what will make more people happy and less people sad, essentially. So he wrote this with his friend, James Mill, and they kind of constructed this philosophy together. This idea that governments should govern based on happiness over pain. So it's about what makes you happy. So if we're thinking about that, if we were to make a decision right now, so you're currently studying independently during the coronavirus pandemic, that's quite difficult. You're currently listening to a video about liberalism, where I'm sure there's many other things that you would enjoy more. So if we would think about this philosophy, what Jeremy Bentham and James Mill would say is, what makes you more happy? Does it make you happier to study, or does it make you happier to go on TikTok? Does it make you happier to play PlayStation? So yes, definitely, in this moment, if I could do anything, I would be playing PlayStation right now, because that makes me happy. I enjoy it. I get a lot of enjoyment from doing that. Sitting down and recording a lesson is less fun, because I'm just talking to myself in a room. So in terms of a utilitarian perspective, I should be playing PlayStation right now rather than recording this, because it's much more engaging and more fun to be playing a video game. However, there's an issue with this, because if I choose not to record this lesson, then my students don't have access to this lesson. If you as my students decide to not listen to this lesson and decide to go on TikTok or whatever it is that you do, then what's going to happen to your future? If we're continuously deciding and making our decisions on what makes us happiest in that moment, how will we ever actually progress and do well in society? So is it right to just have a simple numbers game and to work out, okay, so I'd give this 3 happy points and I'd give this 2 happy points, so I'm going to go and play PlayStation instead? So there are some limits to this. So it's been called, because of this, a philosophy fit for swine. And it's a philosophy fit for swine because essentially all it's doing is promoting this idea that you should just do whatever you want and you should do whatever makes you happy, regardless of your long-term benefits, regardless of what that does for you in the long run. So taking heroin right now will make you happy in that immediate moment when you take that heroin, but obviously there's going to be long-term repercussions to that. Utilitarianism says do what makes you happy. So it's been called a philosophy fit for swine because of that. So this was said by John Stuart Mill. So he is the son of James Mill. And he was actually educated by both Bentham and Mill on the principles of utilitarianism and was considered somewhat of a child prodigy. He had actually written a book before the age of 15, and he was just highly intelligent, very, very thoughtful man. a young man actually. And what ended up happening, because essentially his dad and his dad's friend were experimenting on him to see what would happen if you give a child just an education in science and philosophy, and will that make him a better person as a result of this? And he ends up having a mental breakdown at the age of 21. And it's not only until he discovers poetry, actually, that he recovers from this breakdown. So he ends up becoming quite a critic of utilitarianism, not so much to remove it, but about reforming it instead. And he says, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." So he makes this argument then that when it comes to learning, you actually end up being quite dissatisfied. In fact, I've found in my journey for education, the more I learn, the less I know. Because as you open books and you start learning more and more things, you actually just start realising how much you don't know. And then you have more questions as you're reading. So you're constantly dissatisfied if you're going through the process of education, because you constantly need to learn more. However, he's making this distinction that dissatisfaction isn't a bad thing. If you're going to just pursue lower pleasures, if you're just going to pursue simple pleasures, you're never going to actually be a fulfilled human being. You'll be no more than an animal, a swine. And he makes this distinction. He talks about higher pleasure and lower pleasures. And when he's saying higher pleasures, they are pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments. So these are intrinsically more valuable due to their quality, through them developing our intellect and moral capacity. And he says that these are more important and should be prioritised over lower pleasures. And lower pleasures are associated with our bodily needs and requirements. So essentially, what could be a higher pleasure and a lower pleasure? So a higher pleasure would be sitting down and reading a book, an educational book, obviously. A lower pleasure would be watching TV. So we need to do things like that. We do need to sit and watch TV. Obviously, John Stuart Mill didn't think about this when he wrote that, because TVs didn't exist. But we do need to do that, because watching TV is a good chance for us to just relax and recover. So those are still quite important. But we shouldn't prioritise lower pleasures over higher pleasures, because we still need to develop our brains as well. And he actually says, so if we're going to make this distinction between higher pleasures and lower pleasures, who should decide what we should be doing? Who should be deciding if we're going to sit and read a book or if we're going to sit and watch TV? And he says this: the people are competent judges. Because remember, human beings are rational. So we are competent. We are the best people to make the decision on what is good for us and what is bad for us. He goes on to say that the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them, must be admitted as final. So he's essentially, remember we talked before about his view on plurality voting and saying that, you know, in terms of deciding higher and lower pleasures, yes, individuals are best equipped to decide that for themselves, but the ultimate judgment, i.e. forcing children to go to school, for example, that should be done by the majority, about who decides. Is it, so we're thinking about actually the 19th century when he's writing this, you've got young people who are forced to work in factories to help their families pay for bills and so forth. And because of that, so that's a lower pleasure, that's bodily needs, that's requirement, that's basic things. However, by doing that, those children, one, they risk their lives, but also they won't be getting an education which would better themselves. So according to the government then, they decided to leave it alone and let those children work in those factories because they were fulfilling a purpose. However, what John Stuart Mill argued was, no, we need to actually realise that that's a lower pleasure. We need to distinguish and say, education is a higher pleasure, therefore we should force children to go to school so that they can access a more valuable development rather than just going to work and doing basic things as well. So the theory of the right action then with utilitarianism is always the one which maximises value. And this is quite a popular thought experiment which explores this issue.
The trolley problem. runaway trolley. 4 men in its path. All of them will die. But wait, you can pull a lever. You can change the trolley's course to another track where only one man stands. You have a choice. Kill 1 or let 4 die.
So then that's quite a philosophical question. So imagine you're just walking around and you're at the train tracks and you see that a trolley or a train is run away and the driver's not in control of it. So it's just going to follow the tracks wherever that goes. You have the choice then, because you're standing in front of a lever, which would be an action which could save lives. So there's 4 people on one side and 1 person on the other. If you do nothing, then the train will actually kill those 4 people. If you do something and pull the lever, then 1 person will die as a result. So this is a really difficult moral question. And I think I encourage you to think about it and think about all the different possibilities and the repercussions and the consequences of those decisions. But essentially, utilitarianism argues that you should always pull the lever, because there's a difference between 4 men and 1 man, and 4 men are more valuable because there's more of them than one man. So utilitarianism would say pull the lever.
What are you going to do? Same situation. Runaway trolley. 4 men will die. But this time you're on a bridge. And there's a man there. He's fat. Fat enough to stop 4 men. But he won't jump. He'll need to be pushed. Can you push the man over the edge?
And again, another good question. So the same situation, except there's no lever. The only way that you can save those 4 men's life is to push 1 man over the bridge. Now, again, utilitarianism would advocate for you to push that 1 man, because that's 1 life, which would save 4 lives. So essentially, it's the right action because it maximizes value. Although I feel for the person in this situation, there's a difference between pulling a lever and physically pushing someone over. Nonetheless, utilitarianism says always choose the thing which maximizes value. So Jeremy Bentham then, as a result of these utilitarian views, so John Stuart Mill revised them to say let's consider higher and lower pleasures, but the principles were more or less the same. So Jeremy Bentham, these are the things that he was an early defender of. So economic liberalisation, freedom of expression, the separation of church and state, women's rights, animal rights, the right to divorce, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of capital punishment, the abolition of corporal punishment, prison reform, and decriminalisation of homosexuality, which didn't happen until the latter half of the 20th century. So he's definitely way before his time in terms of a lot of the things that he's advocating here. Something like women's rights as well obviously wasn't very popular. The abolition of slavery, again, talking about that way before there was any meaningful change there. So they're utilitarian values because this essentially promotes more happiness. Because if you're thinking about prison reform and you're thinking about reforming and improving the lives of prisoners, then they're less likely to reoffend. That's better for the whole of society. Thinking about the rights to divorce as well. It doesn't make sense to be forcing people to be unhappy. So essentially, utilitarianism has been criticised for being simply a pleasure-seeking ideology where people are just out to get as much pleasure as humanly possible. However, on the other hand, it is one where you're thinking, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be thinking about people's happiness. And that's a good kind of position to base rights on. So instead of saying, these are what our natural rights are, you have the right to life, liberty and property, it's actually saying you have almost the right to a happy life. And trying to guarantee that through economic, through economic, but also political liberty as well, through guaranteeing women's rights and so forth. So it's a complex ideology in that sense, liberalism, and you can see, just like with conservatism, it's quite fragmented. But essentially, utilitarianism sits within classical liberalism as kind of a deviation from it, saying, we don't fully agree with the idea of natural rights, and instead believe that with natural rights, you're advocating that law should be based on these rights. What Jeremy Bentham and the utilitarians were advocating was law should be based on moral happiness, not on something which is as fixed as rights, but something which can be changing.